Hello, my name is Daniel Stalder, broadband advocate for the Iowa Communications Alliance, bringing you a legislative update from the Iowa Capitol. I want to briefly acknowledge that this week did feel a lot slower than the previous 2 weeks. On Tuesday, actually, the legislature took a large break. President Donald Trump was in Des Moines on a campaign stop, and many Republicans went to the speeches and events that he did. But these sort of pace fluctuations are fairly normal early in the session. This one was for a campaign stop for the president. Oftentimes, if Iowa State is playing basketball, or I think next week the off-year caucuses for the political parties will cause another pause. But oftentimes we ask ourselves, why wasn't there more this week? But there is important stuff going on that keeps legislators around the state or in the Capitol or not in the Capitol on any given week, and this week was certainly one of those. Now, if you read the legislative newsletter that we send, you may notice that the policy content was a little bit lighter, and I want to mention that this was intentional. The bill tracker does have a lot of content in a little space, but you should notice that there is less narrative behind that. Oftentimes the narrative is the why we work in the Capitol, and so I do want to mention that if any time you get a question that you want for us, please feel free to give me an email. I'm always happy to answer any questions that you might have. But I would mention that this part of session does get fairly repetitive. It feels like there's introduction of a bill, we describe the analysis of a bill, there's a subcommittee, then a committee, and then we sort of copy, paste, repeat, rinse and repeat throughout that. With a lot of action in the first couple weeks of session, this part of session sometimes feels like a little bit of slog. So the interesting policy that we work on is a little bit light, but it is just as impactful to mention that the process throughout policy is very important as well. There was an interesting bill, House Study Bill 589, which was scheduled to be considered this week. And I want to make sure I mention that there wasn't an update, and this is oftentimes progress, even though there isn't technically progress. But House Study Bill 589 is the bill that would allow a municipal utility to enter a closed-door session. It was scheduled to go through local government this week, and we were able to work with a small cohort to draft an amendment. This amendment was actually objectionable to the original introducers of the bill, who asked for it to be pulled. We are working with the association that is pushing the bill forward to make sure that there are no impacts to community-based broadband providers, and the way that we're going to go about that is to narrowly tailor the bill so that it's not eligible to be used by municipal broadband utilities. So I would mention that this pause is not necessarily an indicator that the bill is not going to move for the rest of session, but mostly to mention that the legislative process is not always linear. Sometimes we take a break in order to consider amendments to the bill, and House Study Bill 589, I believe this is the case. Another bill which has little progress actually is Senate File 2022. This is our next generation 911 investment, and the bill specifically increases the wireless surcharge for 911 communications from $1 where it is today to $1.15. It then tacks on a annual 2% increase. This bill has not received a subcommittee yet, and that's actually pretty intentional. The introducer of the bill and the chair of the subcommittee is actually out of the Capitol for a little while. He is a National Guard member whose training happened to fall this year during the legislative session. So we expect him to get back in the first weeks of February and be able to move this bill pretty quickly. But this delay is logistical, not really political, certainly not substantive. And so we want to make sure that we mention that we're following this bill, even though we expect that to move in the next few weeks. Now, this week there was a lot of conversation around property taxes. As I mentioned before, there are several proposals out there, and this week we saw subcommittees on 2 of those proposals. They were both in the House, and I want to make sure I mention that we're not providing a detailed analysis for this, because generally speaking, this early in the process, a property tax proposal is an abstract concept only. The subcommittee member Jane Bloomingdale, Representative Bloomingdale from Northern Iowa, mentioned that these property tax bills are not the property tax bill yet, and that there's going to be evolution throughout the process. And so I want to make sure I mention that the language that we're looking at now is not necessarily the language that's going to come forward in any final format. These bills are extremely complex and contain a lot of different proposals, and so I want to make sure I mention that we're going to do the analysis when we sort of get closer to a more finite or a more permanent proposal. And when that happens, we're not entirely sure when that's going to be. So we do monitor these bills very closely as they move throughout the process. But I want to make sure I mention that the Iowa Communications Alliance works hand in hand with a couple other associations where property taxes is their bread and butter. They do policy analysis every day of the week on these things. And so while we're not necessarily in the weeds fighting the good fight on property taxes, I want to make sure I mention that we do belong to the associations and are tracking the policy through those sort of collaborative efforts. This time of year, people start to talk about the legislative funnels. These are procedural deadlines which move policy along or put them to bed for the year. And the first legislative deadline is on February 20th. I want to make sure I mention that we are still 3 weeks away from that deadline. And it's important to note that a lot can happen in the legislative process in that time. As the legislative funnels get closer, you'll start to see a lot more subcommittees and committee meetings getting scheduled. I would also mention that the pace is sometimes at sacrifice to an attention to detail. You'll start to hear things like, we wanted to move this along to keep it alive for the funnel, but we're going to amend it later. That's very, very common because people oftentimes ask for a draft of legislation. The agency, the Legislative Service Agency that drafts legislation, will get backlogged. A bill will come out and have to be put through subcommittee before they have an opportunity to really know what the bill does on paper, and so they'll move through the process to sort of get the ball moving to make sure that the idea is still alive. So I want to make sure I mention that there's a lot of bills we're tracking. Please take a look at the Iowa Communications Alliance bill tracker for a more detailed representation of where a single bill is. But as always, please do reach out to me. My email is constantly getting messages from our members, and I love talking about the policy. If you have any questions at all at any time, please let me know, and I'm happy to talk through it. Thank you again. Bye.